The Pathans, by Olaf Caroe. Chapter 2, The Greek Historians. So far, in respect of the Afghans or Pathans in the pre-Islamic era, we have only examined the traditional sources recorded in a number of writings in Persian, drawn up at the Mughal court not earlier than the beginning of the 17th century. This examination has shown a well-marked consciousness that these people were of at least three different stocks which have come together in juxtaposition, all speaking varieties of the same language, but owing to a predisposition for the tribes not to mix in marriage, preserving a large number of separate tribal cells within the hive. We have also learned much of the intertribal affinities, as these are known to the people themselves. But with regard to ethnic origins, it is difficult to avoid a conclusion that the traditions are little more than fairy tales. Indeed, a postulate that a group of peoples, so diversified as the Afghans and Pathans obviously are, represent a pure and unsullied stream issuing from a single Hebrew source at the time of the Babylonian captivity, must carry its own refutation. From other and better established records, we are aware that the lands which are now Afghanistan and the northwest frontier of Pakistan have seen perhaps more invasions in the course of history than any other country in Asia, or indeed the world. Each horde, as it passed, will have left its mark on the inhabitants of the country, one way of life constantly overlaying another. And there is another point. Over long periods, the line of the Indus, or the escarpment of the mountains west of it, has represented the boundary of kingdoms or empires constantly shifting. The resultant inhabitants of a borderland like this must inevitably bear the marks of mingling civilizations. Our next task, then, is to search the records of foreign historians and archaeology, as these may bear on the terrain itself where the Pathan peoples now live, and to begin as near as possible to the beginning. On the frontier, the Pathans themselves left no early contemporary literature. They built no monument, and we shall have to see how far coinage series minted or current in neighbouring areas elucidate the story. We must at least start by looking elsewhere. The Afghan tradition ostensibly begins in the 6th century with the Babylonian captivity. Let us start, at almost the same time, with the establishment of the Achaemenid Empire of Persia by Cyrus the Great in 559 BC. In that year, Cyrus was enthroned, although he did not overcome Astyages of Media until 550 BC, which may be taken as the real beginning of the Achaemenid era, lasting until the empire was overthrown by Alexander in 331 BC. Over this period of more than 2 centuries, Afghanistan and the northwest frontier as far as the Indus, and after Darius, parts of the Punjab also, were included in the confines of a tremendous Persian dominion. Again and again, when moving in what may be called the Iranian world, I have been struck by the conviction that the influence of Persia over all these lands is a much deeper, older thing than anything which springs from Islam. Were it Islamic only, we should expect to find the sheer sectarianism of Persia reproduced among the Pathans. In fact, the Pathan frontiersman, with few exceptions, is an orthodox Sunni of the Hanafi school. The fact that Persian sectarianism has not broken the ties which undoubtedly unite the Iranian world, so different from that of Arabia, shows that those ties have been forged by influences older and other than religious. There is indeed a sense in which all the upland in Asia, from the Tigris to the Indus, is one country. The spirit of Persia has breathed over it, bringing an awareness of one background, one culture, one way of expression, a unity of spirit felt as far away as Peshawar and Quetta. He who has caught that breath has won to the heart of a mystery, and he will not forget. No one who enters, say, Peshawar or Banu from the Punjab, or mounts the hills west of them, can fail to remark that he has left one region of the world for another, and he is on the verge of the Iranian plateau. To him, the mountains are different, the plants burgeon, the seasons revolve, the willow, the plane, the cypress appear, the rivers flow bright and gay as if alive. The birds recall the west. The sun and wind have an uplifting keenness. The men are the men of Central Asia, not of the subcontinent he has left behind. The real message of Professor Gershman's recent book on Persia before Islam is that he proves Persian civilization to be far older and broader based than the Islamic inspiration which it absorbed unconquered. He shows how profound and beneficent was the Achaemenid influence on the outlying provinces, particularly in Gandhara, the Peshawar Valley, and among the Scythians. Achaemenid art and architecture even persuaded the Maurya dynasty of India, circa 323 to 190 BC, to reproduce the glories of Persepolis in their palaces, while Kharoshthi, an early Indian alphabet, was developed from the official Aramaic, the alphabet of the Persian state. From contact between the Persian language and that of the peoples of the adjacent Indus Valley, there arose for the use of the conqueror, and conquered a sort of mixed dialect of the style of Urdu. Thus, the fact that Transoxiana, Afghanistan, and Pakistan west of the Indus are even now Khurasani in culture is due in the first instance not to Islamic conquests but to earlier Achaemenian, Parthian, and Sasanian influences spreading from Persia over those countries. The first and most overpowering of these Persian influences was the empire of Cyrus and Darius the Great, and for that period our records, almost if not quite contemporary, are the Greek historian Herodotus and the inscriptions of Darius at Susa, at Bisitun, Behistun, and on his tomb at Nakshi Rustam near Persepolis in the Persian province of Fars. It is convenient to refer first to the inscriptions of Darius, recorded either on rocks or slabs of dressed stone. Among a number of recitations, instinct with a pride and vain glory which read oddly in an inhibited age, are detailed lists of the satrapies of the empire. The eastern satrapies are given as Arya, Herat, Bactria, Balkh, Chorasmia, Khwarizm or Khiva, Satagidia, uncertain, Sogdiana between the Oxus and Jaxartes, Arachosia, Kandahar, Gandhara, Peshawar Valley, and India. The Old Persian actually used for the three satrapies most relevant to our present inquiries is Thatagush, Satagidia, Gadara, Gandhara, and Hindush, India. The Indian satrapy is not given in the Bisitun inscription, which was carved early in Darius's reign to commemorate the victories by which he attained power, but it is given in those in the palace at Persepolis and at Nakshi Rustam on Darius's tomb, showing that India was acquired during Darius's reign. The Gandhara, or Peshawar Valley, satrapy appears in all three inscriptions. It should be remarked here that there is no need to argue the identification of Gandhara with the Peshawar Valley. It is one well attested throughout the Mauryan, Greco-Bactrian, Kushan, and later periods right up to the time of Al-Biruni, writing of Mahmud of Ghazni in the 11th century AD, and it is universally accepted. And, as we shall see, there is confirmation for it in Herodotus. It is possible that Gandhara up to the Indus was a part of Cyrus's conquests at the opening of the Achaemenid era, and certain that, if it was not then included in the empire, its inclusion was confirmed as one of Darius's earliest acts. Cambyses, who was the great king intervening between Cyrus and Darius, reigned only for 7 years and did not come east. He was too fully occupied with his conquest of Egypt, his abortive expedition to Ethiopia, and the planning of an assault on Carthage which never came off. We know also that Darius's conquest of India, by which is probably meant the Doab between the Indus and the Jhelum rivers, was not undertaken until an exploring expedition under the Greek Syllax had been sent from Gandhara down the Indus to feel the way and learn the geography. This could not have been done until the ground was firm in Gandhara itself. Let us now see what Herodotus has to say in these matters. There are many references in various English works to one or other passage of Herodotus, which may have a bearing on the early history of the northwest frontier. These range from the uncritical surmises of Bellew, who does not seem to have been able to read the Greek, to the withering contempt of Ravati, dismissing all references to the father of history in this context as a farrago of Herodotus and Hindus. Many later scholars, including Sir George Grierson, Sir Aurel Stein, and Professor Morgenstern, have contributed their views, and these will be referred to in what follows. I would claim that my analysis at least puts forward for the first time a reasoned study of all the Herodotean passages that are relevant, buttressed by epigraphical and other sources where these exist. I give the passages in the order in which I propose to consider them. I have not Latinized the Greek here. 1. Herodotus, Book 4, 44. Of the greater part of Asia, Darius was the discoverer. Wishing to know where the river Indus, the only river save one producing crocodiles, emptied itself into the sea, he sent a number of men on whose truthfulness he could rely, and among them Skulaks of Karuanda, to sail down the river. These started from the city of Caspuros and the country of Paktues, and sailed down the river to the east and the sunrise to the sea. Here they turned westward, and after a voyage of 30 months arrived at the place from which the Egyptian king sent the Phoenicians to circumnavigate Libya, Africa. After the voyage was completed, Darius conquered the Indians and made use of the sea in those parts. 2. Herodotus, Book 3, 102. In addition, there are other Indians who border on the city of Caspuros and the country of Paktues. These live to the north and in the direction of the north wind as compared with the remaining Indians, and their way of life is almost the same as that of the Bactrians. They are the most warlike of all the Indians. 3. Herodotus, Book 3, 91. In this and the two succeeding passages, the historian is giving a list of the Achaemenid satrapies and their peoples. The Satagudai and the Gandarioi and the Dadikai and the Aparutai, who were all reckoned together, paid 170 talents. This was the seventh satrapy. 4. Herodotus, Book 3, 93, from Paktues and the Armenians. The sum drawn was 400 talents. This was the 13th satrapy. 5. Herodotus, Book 3, 94. The Indians, who are more numerous than all the others we have seen, paid more than any other people, namely 360 talents of gold dust, equivalent to 4,680 ordinary talents. This was the 20th satrapy. 6. Herodotus, Book 7, 66-67, giving the roll call of Xerxes' army. The Gandarioi and the Dadikai had the Bactrian equipment in all respects. The Paktues wore cloaks of skin and carried the bow of their country and the dagger. 7. Herodotus, Book 1, 125, the Sagatioi, who are nomads. 8. Herodotus, Book 7, 85, the nomad tribe known as Sagatioi, a people Persian in language and in dress half Persian, half Paktuan, who furnished to the army as many as 8,000 horse. It is remarkable that in the first two passages, in which the author is considering quite different and unconnected points, he speaks of the city of Caspuros. The accent would fall on the pre-penultimate syllable in the nominative case, and the country of Paktues in the same breath. Quite evidently, he considers them together. The identification to which older scholars, including Grierson, author of the Linguistic Survey of India, have adhered is that in the Paktues and Paktues of Herodotus we may see the prototype of the Paktuns. It should be said at once that later scholars, including Professors Morgenstern of Oslo and Bailey of Cambridge, have come out strongly against this equation. I will attempt to state the case as I see it. Leaving aside for the moment the identification of Paktues, what and where was Caspuros? 50 years ago no scholar had ventured an opinion. It was indeed accepted that Sylaks, the captain cook of his day since he started down the river going east, must have embarked on the river Kabul, known as the Landai in Peshawar district. This river runs almost due east from Kabul past Jalalabad, through the Khyber Hills a few miles north of the pass itself, and then through the Peshawar Valley where, after joining the Swat River, it falls into the Indus near Attock, after which the Indus runs almost due south to the sea. The change of direction at Attock would not necessarily have been known to Herodotus, though to anyone who sailed down the river, even in those days, the topography makes it clear enough, and it would have been clear to Scylax. The point of substance is that the voyage started in the direction of the sunrise. But where was Caspuros? It could not have been Kabul, for the river is not navigable at that point. Here, it is necessary to put in a word of local knowledge about the course of the Kabul River and navigation on it. It is not navigable by boats of any size until it has reached its confluence with the Kunar close to Jalalabad, and even from that point, it is not safe owing to the rapids in its passage from Laupura to Warsak through the Khyber Hills. Rafts are floated down on this stretch, but real navigation does not begin until the river issues into the Peshawar Plain by Warsak and Mikhni. At this point, at the present day, it divides into three main streams, reading from the north: the Sardariab, the Naguman, and the Shah Alam. There is also a small fourth branch, the Budni. The three main branches reunite at Nisata just below Charsada, the northerly stream having taken meanwhile the Swat confluence. The Budni rejoins the Shah Alam at Dilazak. Below the confluence, the united stream is known as the Landai. The distance from Peshawar to the Nisata confluence is 16 miles, to the nearest point on the Shah Alam, the most southerly stream, 7 miles, and to the Budni channel only 1 mile. It is well known that the course of all these channels has varied even in recent times, and in the Mughal period there were probably only 2 channels. Peshawar is not on the banks of the river, but all Peshawaris are conscious of the Landai as their own river, and many of them still navigate it. One point is quite clear. Scylax could not have embarked on this river at any point much above the neighbourhood of Peshawar, and we should therefore look for Caspuros in that vicinity. Is there any other mention of it? There is. It appears in a fragment of the geographer and chronicler Herodotus of Miletus, writing in 500 BC, even earlier than Herodotus, but in the form Caspuros. Moreover, Herodotus states that his Caspuros is in Gandhara, as Herodotus places his Caspuros in Paktues, an interesting clue to the identity of Gandhara with Paktues, to which I shall return. From this point, the suggestion is now put forward, brilliantly I think, by 2 scholars who do not always see eye to eye, that Caspuros is a scribal error of a common enough kind for Pascapuros, and that Pascapuros is Peshawar. This compares well with the Polu Shapolu of the Chinese pilgrim Yuan-Tsang, the Sanskrit Purushapura, and the early Muslim forms of Purshapur or Pushabur in Al-Biruni and others. The divergence between the Herodotean Caspuros and the Hecatean Caspuros is not substantial, and, were it not for one point, need not detain us. This is the point. There is a passage in Al-Biruni where that author tells us that Multan was originally known as Kasyapapura. From this, the Orientalists Herzfeld and Foucher deduced that Multan may be the Caspapuros from which Scylax sailed down the Indus to the ocean. But not even Herodotus, and certainly not a navigator like Scylax, can ever have imagined that he was sailing east when setting out down the Indus from Multan. Moreover, this identification overlooks the location by Herodotus of Caspapuros in Gandhara and by Herodotus in Paktues. That apart, there has fortunately been preserved by Athenaeus, circa AD 200, a fragment of the original narrative of Scylax himself, which shows that in the course of his voyage a mountain ran alongside the river, and in places it was high and covered with thick forest and thorn bushes. This passage, ably dug out by 2 Belgian scholars, Honigman and Marik, exactly describes the gorges below Attock, past Shadipur and Calabar, down to Bilot. It is inapplicable to a voyage starting at Multan in the midst of the Punjab plain. the Multan hypothesis may be ruled out. There is a further piece of evidence supporting the emendation Caspuros equals Peshawar, this time epigraphical. At Naqshi Rustam, by the rock tombs of Darius and his line, American archaeologists of the Chicago Oriental Institute have recently uncovered a fascinating bilingual inscription in the name of Shapur I, the second emperor of the Sassanid line, who defeated and took captive the Roman Emperor Valerian at the Battle of Edessa in AD 260. This inscription, in Parthian and Greek, gives a place named Pshkbur/Paskibura as the limit of the Sasanian Empire to the east. The correspondence of this place name, both with the emendation of Herodotus to Paskapuros and with the Sanskrit Purushapura and the modern Peshawar, is surely close enough to rule out coincidence and to resolve philological doubt. Moreover, the occurrence of this name in the Sasanian age, just halfway between the era of Herodotus and that of Al-Biruni, provides the very link that is required. The sum of this argument is that we have excellent reason for identifying Herodotus's Caspuros with Peshawar. We then find that his story of Silax's voyage and starting place fits neatly into place. Peshawar is the town within a very few miles of the river, near the only obvious spot where Silax could have embarked in order to sail eastward into the sunrise and eventually down the Indus to the sea. The hypothesis also fits the other passage about the bravest and most warlike Indians living north of all the others and near Caspuros. It is quite unnecessary to point to the present-day inhabitants of that country, though they too answer to that description. For present days apart, the truth of Herodotus's assessment was demonstrated to Alexander when he invaded these regions a century and a half after Herodotus's time. With this point fixed, we may proceed to locate Paktues, which, as I have said, Herodotus more than once couples with Caspuros. Paktues, then, is the country in which the city of Caspuros/Peshawar was situated, and must therefore be Gandhara, the Peshawar Valley, and its environment. Indeed, Hecataeus' Caspuros is admittedly in Gandhara, so the equation Paktues/Gandhara/Peshawar Valley is established. Let us now refer to the third passage cited, in which Herodotus, without assigning a name to the satrapy, tells us that Darius' seventh satrapy was inhabited by 4 tribes: the Satagudai, the Gandarioi, the Dadikai, and the Aparutai. We are not surprised to find the Gandarioi among these tribes. Obviously, this seventh satrapy is Gandhara, the Gandhara of the Darius inscriptions, and the Paktues of Herodotus. We will leave identification of the other 3 tribes aside for the moment and turn to the 4th passage quoted. In that passage, Herodotus, very surprisingly, speaks of another Paktues, which he couples with Armenia and tells us is the 13th satrapy of the empire. It has hitherto been assumed that this is a different place from the Paktues from which Silax sailed. This interpretation seems to me almost certainly wrong. The Achaemenid inscriptions nowhere bracket any other country with Armenia, which is always shown as a separate satrapy. It is surely much more likely that in writing down the names of Darius's satrapies, the historian or his scribe made a slip and misplaced the name Paktues, which should have been given as that of the 7th satrapy, where the Gandarioi, etc. lived, and not as that of the 13th. This supposition brings this reference into line with the other 2 Herodotean passages where Paktues, as we have shown, is on the Kabul River and corresponds to Gandhara. The Paktues from which Silax sailed is mentioned only a couple of pages later in the history. Had there really been 2 countries in the Achaemenid Empire with this name, a strange enough idea in itself, Herodotus could hardly have failed to note and explain it. I conclude, therefore, that the name of the 7th satrapy, in which the Gandarioi and 3 other tribes are said to have dwelt, was variously Paktues or Gandhara. The 5th passage is only relevant as showing that Gandhara and India were quite separate satrapies, as indeed is proved by the Achaemenid inscriptions themselves. India was not conquered, as we know from the first passage, until after Silax's voyage was completed from Gandhara which was already a part of the empire. The eastern limit of Darius's Indian province is not accurately known, but we shall see that Alexander's campaigns suggest it was the Jhelum River, and at the very furthest not beyond the present boundaries of West and East Punjab. It is interesting that the India of Herodotus, and indeed of Alexander and the Greeks and Romans generally, was a part of what we now know as the Punjab and Sindh. It was the valley of the Indus, and geographically comparable with West Pakistan of today, omitting the frontier districts. In a setting of ancient history, Pakistan has thus a better claim to be known as India than has the Bharat of post-partition days since 1947. Darius, Herodotus, Alexander, Pompey, Horace, Trajan would certainly have thought of India in the geographical terms of what is now West Pakistan. In the sixth passage, the Paktues, obviously the inhabitants of Paktuka, are mentioned as part of Xerxes' army, and Herodotus tells us that they were armed with the bow and the dagger. It is perhaps worth noting that, until matchlocks came in, the bow was the weapon normally carried by Pathan tribesmen of the historical period, and the dagger is still preeminently the weapon of all the hill tribes. Afridis and Wazirs take particular pride in their long war knives, as much a part of their characteristic equipment as is the kukri to the Gurkha. Having fixed Caspuros as Peshawar and Paktuke as the country around Peshawar, are we to suppose that the similarity of Paktuki and Paktues to the modern Pakhtun is purely fortuitous? Grierson accepted the identification, but it is frowned on by more recent and very eminent Orientalists. The chief of these are Professors Bailey of Cambridge and Morgenstern of Oslo. The latter in particular has much practical experience in this field, and very great weight must be given to his conclusions. Let us examine on what grounds the correspondence does not find favour. Professor Bailey's reasons are set out in an article entitled Kusanika in the Journal of the British School of Oriental and African Studies, and were formulated in 1952. His objection is founded on an assertion that, for philological reasons, Paktus cannot be connected with Pashtun. According to him, the hard pronunciation, Pakhtun, is comparatively new and dialectal. Later in the same article, he admits that the Greeks used kt for Iranian kat, for example, Bactra for Persian Bactries. It follows, therefore, that his argument stands solely on his firm rejection of the pronunciation Pakhtun. He goes on to suggest the identification of Paktus with the Patu in North Chitral, of whom few have heard. Professor Morgenstern's views are comprised in a very recent article contributed by him to the fourth fascicule of the new edition of the Encyclopedia of Islam, article Afghan. He also regards Pashtun as the classical variant and refers, rightly of course, to Pakhtun as the northeastern way of speaking. Like Bailey, he too affirms that kht is a later dialectal form and that shtt could not have been rendered by Greek kt. He therefore rejects the equation for the same reasons. He goes on to make a very interesting connection of Pashtun with Ptolemy's Parshitai, Ilapavijtiem, a tribe inhabiting the Parapomissus. My own reaction to this identification is that the Parsitai, of which the ancient form is said to have been Parswana, are getting very close to the people of Pars, or Fars, the Persians or Farsiwans, as the Pathans still call them. Farsiwan, or Parsiwan, is a very usual and slightly pejorative appellation for Persians, in use to describe Tajiks and other Persian speakers whom the true Pathan affects to despise. Morgenstern does not tell us what has become of the Paktus. Both these authorities, it will be seen, are definite in their statements that the orthodox linguist must regard the replacement of the digraph by Caroe as a modern dialectal development. I have seen it suggested that an example of this phonetic rule is to be found in the comparatively recent change from the equivalent of Heijich to the equivalent of K in Castilian Spanish. It is also true that Afghan government spokesmen from Kabul are very definite in their assertions that the soft Pashtu of Kandahar, which employs the shesh, is the original and classical variant of the language. With great respect, I differ. It seems probable that the predilection for Pashtu/Pashtun over Pakhtu/Pakhtun is not uninfluenced by views emanating from Kabul, prompted by the Durrani speakers of the language. The Paktues of Herodotus did not live around Kandahar where the Durranis come from, but in the Peshawar Valley, and I should require far more convincing proof to compel agreement to the proposition that the hard pronunciation is quite new around Peshawar. There are further things to say. One who has lived many years with Pathans will tell you that the KH peculiar to the language shades into sh almost imperceptibly. It often seems to depend on how much phlegm is in the speaker's throat. The premise that the hard variant is a recent dialect overlooks the opinion of all the Pathans around Peshawar, who regard the language as spoken by the Yusufzais of Mardan and Swabi as the best of all. There is another neat piece of evidence to the antiquity of the hard Caroe. Arrian, Anabasis 4:23, speaks of the river Uaspla, probably the Kunar, as the place where Alexander met the Aspasii. Aristotle, Strabo, and Quintus Curtius call this river the Coaspes. Since Eve in Greek means good, kois evidently a Greek transcription of the word good in the language of the Aspasii, or at any rate in the Iranian usage of that part of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. It is the river of the good horse. The Pakhtu word for good is identical, ko or ku. Pashtu is sho or shu. It is true that we know from Herodotus that the river Karun, on which Susa was situated, was also called in the Greek transcription the Coaspes, and that there can be no question of the use of a prototype of Pakhtu in that case. It can also be argued that Hua is the Old Persian for good, and might conceivably be transliterated as ko in Greek. But the close correspondence of Kovid the Pakhtu is so much more striking that a refusal to accept it as a pointer in this region amounts to a form of academic special pleading. At least it is established that in Alexander's time there was in use in the Kunar district an Iranian language with an affinity for a hard variant. In the following chapter, I have sought to draw the skein tighter by pointing to a possible correspondence between the names of the Aspasii and the Isapsai, Yusufzai, the protagonists at the present time of the hard variant of the modern language. In short, let us break a lance with the phoneticians and, adopting the hard variant, boldly link Pakhtun with Paktues. It all fits too neatly to be as naive as Bailey thinks. There are other equations yet to be made. One of the 4 tribes mentioned by Herodotus, hypothetically resident in Paktuki or Gandhara, is the Aparutai. These have been identified by Grierson, Stein, and other noted Orientalists with the Afrides. In this case, Morgenstern admits that, phonetically at least, the correspondence is possible. The Afrides and many others among the Pathans, even today, habitually change F into P, and indeed, this is a recognised phonetic transference. It need hardly be said that acceptance of the equation aparutai with aparidai, for that is how the Afrides pronounce it, by no means carries with it the conclusion that the aparutai of Darius' 7th satrapy occupied the identical territory in Tira, Bazar, and the Khaibar and Kohat passes now held by the Aparidai. But it is to be noted that the Aparutai are mentioned as a tribe inhabiting a territory in that satrapy near to, if not contiguous with, the Gandarioi, and there is no doubt whatever that the Gandarioi are the people of the Peshawar Valley, and, as we know, the Aparides' home today is just there, next to the Peshawar Valley. Moreover, the homes of the greater number of the Aparidai are situated in mountain eyries, hard of approach, and leading nowhere but to alpine pastures in the Sufid Ko from 10,000 to 15,000 feet above the sea. It has never been worthwhile for any empire to occupy this territory. The addition of the Aparutai/Aparidai correspondence helps to buttress the case for finding in Herodotus traces of names which carry through to the present day. Belu has gone further and identified the Satagudai with the famous Katak tribe, and the Dadikai with an obscure branch of Kakars, whom he calls Dadi. Of the Dadi I have never heard, but Belu's connection. Satagudai/Katak is provocative of thought. Satagudai is merely a Greek transcription of the old Persian Thatagush, which appears in the Achaemenid Inscriptions as one of the satrapies of the empire. Its exact location is uncertain, but that it was on the eastern confines seems clear enough, for in the lists it appears in the group India, Arachosia, Kandahar, and Gandhara. Gershman places it west of the Indus and south of Gandhara, that is to say, roughly in the region of Kohat, Banu, the Derajat, and Waziristan in modern geography. This is a country in which the Katak tribe still occupy large parts. According to their own tradition, they once occupied the Tochi Valley, from which they were displaced by their cousins the Shitaks, a point which connects their name with an even wider territory than that which they now hold. Neither Belu nor Ravati were conversant with the Achaemenid inscriptions. Ravati sneers at Belu's equation mainly on the ground that Belu, in seeking to justify it, stated incorrectly that in Pashtu, as opposed to Pakhtu, the name of the tribe could be pronounced Shatak, approximating to Satagudai. On this point, Ravati was right, for the initial letter of Katak is K, which is not susceptible of change. It is the letter Kin, which, in the soft dialects, is changed to Shin. The Kataks never call themselves Shataks. But both Ravati and Belu had forgotten, or never knew of, the existence of another important Kalanri tribe, allied to the Kataks both in ancestry and in location, namely the Shitaks. Shitak is the appellation common to the tribes which now inhabit the Tochi Valley and the Banu Plain, known more popularly as the Daos and Banuchis. Moreover, as mentioned, the Kataks say that they once held the lands now occupied by their Shitak cousins and were later driven northeastward to their present locations in the Kohat and Peshawar districts. Neither Kataks nor Shitaks appear by name until the period of publication of genealogies under the Mughals and the time of Akbar's dealings with the Kataks for the protection of the highway to Peshawar. Babur indeed, in his memoirs, mentions the Karanis, Kalanris, whom he encountered in 1505 around Banu, along with the Niazis and Isakal. It is probable that this reference of his is to Kataks or Shitaks, or both, for both are Kalanri tribes, and the other Kalanris who live in that area, Wazirs and Bangash. Babur mentions by name when he comes to them. In any case, we need not be disturbed by the absence of early nominal references. Even the Abdalis, rulers of Afghanistan for the last 2 centuries, do not appear in any records until later than this. Not indeed until the time of the Safawi Empire in the 17th century. Taken together, the Kataks and the Shitaks, who now have a common boundary close to Banu, cover a stretch of territory as large as that held by any Afghan or Pathan tribe, whether Yusufzai, Durrani, or Galji. From the Katak settlements around Lundqar, close to the Malakan Pass, to the Shitak villages in Upper Daur in the Toki, the distance is over 200 miles. The wide extent of their present territory, their large population, and the association of both groups of tribes at one time or another with the rich oases of Banu and the Tochi suggest sufficiently their importance in this family of peoples. They did not spring from nowhere in the night. They are Kalanris, not of the true Sarbanri Afghan stock. Thatagush is evidently to be located somewhere around where they are now. It is a leap in the dark, but it is tempting to find in the Achaemenian Thatagush and in the Herodotian Satagudai not only the phonetic but the actual archetype of great tribal congregations whose name has been written large in frontier history ever since. In Mughal times, the identification of individual tribes became possible. The last 2 Herodotian passages quoted refer to a tribe of nomads called the Sagatioi, the chief cavalrymen of the state in Xerxes' army, and a people Persian in language and in dress, half Persian and half Pakhtuan. This is a description which might well fit the Abdali, Durrani tribes, as they have been known since they emerged from obscurity in the time of Nadir Shah a little more than 2 centuries ago. They are the Afghan people who live furthest to the west and closest to Persia, and since they first came to notice in the time of Shah Abbas the Great, 1587 to 1629, and later in Nadir Shah's time, 1730 to 47, they have always been inclined, among the chiefs at least, to the Persian language in preference to Pashto. They are also more deeply imbued with Persian culture than any Afghans, much more so, for instance, than the Ghalgis who ruled in Persia for 15 years. Of the Duranis, Elphinstone gives a description highly relevant in this context. He writes that they understand Persian and that their dress, arms and habitations, while retaining their national peculiarities, approach to those of Persia. He also stresses the pastoral and nomadic character of this tribe and the express condition on which in his time, 1809, they held their country, namely that they should furnish a horseman for every plough. Alexander Burns, too, writing 20 years later, observes that all the Duranis in Kabul spoke Persian, and many of the higher classes had no Pashto whatever, a phenomenon just as apparent today. In every respect, the few words of Herodotus about the Sagatioi would fit the Duranis as they have come to be known during the last 2 centuries of our era. Sagatia figures as a satrapy only on one of Darius's inscriptions, that on the palace at Persepolis. Its absence from the others suggests that the Sagatioi may have rebelled or been absorbed in other satrapies. The location of the satrapy is also in doubt. Gershman places it between Meshed and Herat, an area over which the Abdalis were trying to assert supremacy when they were checked by Nadir Shah early in the 18th century. It is interesting to note that the Abdalis themselves claim descent from a legendary ancestor called Shakarbun, a name which, though not recorded in early sources, is not uncommon in Pashto. Is it just possible to suggest that Shakarbun may enshrine some faint memory of the Sagatioi? Before leaving Herodotus, it is fair to give Ravati the last word in deploying his case against what he terms the Herodotean myth. He writes, "The Afghans, though divided into numerous tribes, are undoubtedly one race and speak one original language. Had they been the aborigines of the country at present known as Afghanistan, we must have heard something of them from ancient writers, for we find that even in the time of Herodotus, Darius sent an exploring expedition under Silax of Karianda and others as far as the Indus." Having written the above, he appends an illustrative footnote giving a translation of Herodotus 4:44, the first passage cited in this chapter, namely as Ravati gives it. These, setting out from the city of Caspuros and the country of Paktues, sailed down the river towards the east and sunrise to the sea. The inconsistency between these 2 italicized passages is glaring. Having stated in his text that nothing has been heard from the ancient writers concerning the very people about whose language he is writing a Pakhto grammar, he proceeds to illustrate this negative finding by citing a passage in Herodotus, specifically mentioning Paktues. And he fails wholly to notice either the coincidence or the contradiction. He goes on from his premise to agree with the Afghan chronicler's theme of the Hebrew origin of the tribes. My own reading is that, on the contrary, the string of passages in Herodotus, showing as they do so wide and so interconnected a similarity of nomenclature, both of place and tribal name and habit, with what we can see today, cannot fairly be regarded as coincidental. There are too many coincidences for that. For consider, here is Herodotus twice mentioning Caspuros, a fair emendation surely, as the city of Paktuki, the Paktues whose chief weapon is the dagger. Tribes in this region called the Aparutai and Gandarioi sail eastward down the river of Paktuke into the Indus, the tribe of the Satagudai, and lastly, the bravest of all Indians who lived to the north by the country of Paktuke, all connected in one complex of description of this corner of the world. It seems a not unreasonable conclusion to see in these the city of Peshawar, capital of the province known as Pakhtunland or Gandhara, inhabited by Gandarians, later to be known as Kandaris and Afridis and possibly Kataks, and a sail down the Kabul, Landai River into the Indus to the sea. That there is no hint in Herodotus of a prototype for Afghan is not surprising and is what the genealogies would lead us to expect. We shall see later that after Achaemenid times, this country was swept again and again by devastating invasions and migrations, leading to the disintegration of old tribal units and the agglomeration of new ones. But this process would have taken place chiefly in the wide open plains and valleys where the tribes who now regard themselves as in the true Afghan line now dwell. There is plenty of evidence after we reach the period of documented history to show that the hill tribes have been little incommoded by empires and the passage of armies. They let the legions thunder past. So the insistence of the genealogies on a non-Afghan origin for the hill tribes, those like the Afridis and Kataks lumped together as Karlanris, can be held to reflect a knowledge that they represented a more aboriginal stock, which only later absorbed the characteristics of the invaders. In other words, it is not surprising that in looking for a prototype in the oldest recorded history bearing on this region, we hit on the ancestor of the Pakhtun, rather than on that of the Afghan. This is not to assert that the ethnic or linguistic stock can be traced through to tribes of similar names today. The case would be rather that these were substratum agglomerations of people who, through contact with later comers, modified their language and were assimilated to later cultures, but retained in the more inaccessible places sufficient of their older inspirations to boast their original names. The theory does at least give a starting point to Pathan history more reasoned, and let me add more exciting than the stock belief in the Bani Israel. Perhaps it would be fair to conclude the Herodotean argument with the words of Winston Churchill on Fair Rosamond. Tiresome investigators have undermined this excellent tale, but it certainly should find a place in any history worthy of the name. If Pathans themselves are in doubt, or hanker after more traditional forebears, let them remember that Herodotus was the first to call the people around Paktues the bravest of all the people in those parts.